Hello and welcome to ThomasTalks, a series of relaxed conversations but hopefully revealing, where we meet face to face and discuss pertinent issues around human matters with experts from the world of occupational psychology and people development. I am Greetje Brosens, International Managing Director at Thomas, and I am with Steve Cuppello and Lillian. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Steve Cuppello. I work as a psychologist at Thomas International. I have a particular interest in diversity and adverse impact and bias in the workplace.
And I'm Lillian. I work for a company that works closely with Thomas International called the People Academy, and we're specialists in leadership and management development, working in both sport and commerce.
So our topic today is what's stalling progress for women at work. We've talked a lot about gender bias, so what is bias exactly?
Maybe a place to start is to say we are all biased. If you go back into history, our brains are actually wired to be biased in the first place. Our brain functions on categories and being able to make judgments about things. That's how it has the capacity to do all the things that it does. So given that we're all biased, the issue for gender bias is when that manifests itself in a way that either undermines or marginalises women, or where decisions are taken as a result of those biases, which puts women in a less fortunate position than other genders, particularly men. I guess that's where I start from.
I think from my point of view, I'm really interested to speak to you two about how we fit in with this, how men fit in with this. I think sometimes things like feminism can be misconstrued and thought of as, in terms of being somehow anti-male, which is obviously not true. We all know we're biased, as you say, so what can we do to stop that having an impact on the decisions that we make, and how can we support that cause? Can you guys describe kind of personal experiences, or perhaps experiences that you have that could perhaps ground this topic a bit more in terms of ways that you have heard of or experienced gender bias? I
think that probably most women in the workplace have experienced bias of some sort or other. Not the conscious sort of bias that people think about. You know, I don't think
what do you mean
most
by
people,
conscious as opposed
well,
to
you know, often
conscious?
People think it's the obvious sexist comments that alone is bias. But I think it's the more subtle things that are biased. And I'll give an example. I used to run a coaching practice to help engineering firms attract and retain more female engineers. And I ran a session with a senior leadership team at an energy firm. Before I even had a chance to start the session, one of the guys in the room, and needless to say it was an almost completely male room, with the exception of one woman who was the HR director, one of the men, even before we started, stood up and said, I know we're going to talk about bias and stuff here, but let me just say one thing. My wife cannot read a map at all, and I can give you many examples of that. And then he started on the 10-minute rant as to how they drive to places and she can never find her way. And the woman at the other side of the table, who was the HR director, stood up really angrily and said, and that's why I ended up in HR. I was an engineer working in this firm. Now I'm in HR because I couldn't bear it any longer. And I think it's just, I don't think that man thought of himself as not thinking of men and women as equal. But in his head, there were certainly things that men did better than women, which then results in the little subtle biased decisions that get made every day.
And I think often some of the things that come out, like you said, it's a lack of awareness, but also some of the things that come out are said with the best intentions without really understanding what the implications are. So I recently experienced a male manager whose female second in command was up for promotion and was getting married. And he sat down and said, you're very capable, you're really, really good at your job, but you know what, is this really the right time? Because you're getting married, and maybe one day, maybe next year or the year after, you might have a baby. And she actually withdrew herself from the promotion opportunity as a result of that conversation. Now, in his head, what he was doing was saying, you sure it's the right time? But actually what he did was to take any choice away from that woman and her future. You know, was she going to have kids? Well, who knows? You know, was marriage going to change her life? Who knows? But he just took away every decision that she had and didn't realise that he was doing it.
But women do that too, right? I don't think it's just men doing that.
No.
I think women make assumptions for themselves and for other women too. I think I could certainly think back of moments in my career where I've probably biased against other women because I made assumptions on their career choices after having children.
I think there's a lack of awareness as well. I remember having this conversation recently with a group of friends, and a female friend was talking about how there is a difference in privilege and how, as a man in the workplace, you naturally have certain advantages over women. You're more likely to get paid more, you're more likely to be promoted. There's that kind of thing, and so men need to be aware of the fact that they have got these advantages. And a couple of my friends, one in particular, who were men who would not at all consider themselves to in any way bias, but really took exception to this and really took offence that they could be considered to be part of the problem or anyway advantaged by this because they don't personally see themselves as behaving this way and acting this out. So I think we're not necessarily aware that it happens as well, and like you say, it is subtle. How do you see it manifesting in the workplace in terms of what issues do you think women face as a result of bias, conscious or otherwise?
I think there's a number of things. One of the things that is that in some jobs, male characteristics are valued higher than typical female characteristics.
What do you mean as male? You
I
know,
shouldn't have asked that question to a psychologist, should I? Okay, so behaviours. I'll say behaviours. So I've recently been in working with groups where women, for whatever reason, were in the minority, and they were also isolated because of the behaviour of the men, because it was very boisterous. It was the description that the women have used, their words were, it was a boys' club. It was the humour was very aggressive, there was very little listening, there was very little collaboration, there was a lot of internal competition, and the women either didn't want to participate in that or didn't feel comfortable participating in that kind of behaviour. And I think that can feel very isolating for women.
And that's probably particularly interesting thinking about underrepresentation of women at board level. If there is a male culture, typically then women trying to operate in those environments is going to be that much more challenging for them than it would be for anyone else, for men.
I always get a little bit nervous when we talk about male culture and female culture because, you know, it's often mentioned around women in the boardroom how they add different skills, how they perhaps are more communicative, collaborative, etc. And I find it very dangerous that we start describing the world in things that women are good at and things that men are good at and things that women bring to the table and things that men bring to the table, because in general, people are people, and there might be men or there will be men who are very, very collaborative, and there will be women who are not collaborative at all. And it's a huge pressure on women, and on men for that matter, that we all of a sudden have to bring these skills to the boardroom that we might or might not have.
And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, that this is the way that you're supposed to be, when actually the differences within a group are much bigger than the differences between them.
Yes. It's a difficult one because that boys' culture, I think there's definitely something that all women feel is there and it's hard to describe. But when we go about language and describing things as typically male and typically female, that's why I just think we have to be more careful.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, using he to describe a group of people was traditionally the way to do things in the English language, but the reality is that then there's an assumption that women were never part of that group or could never be part of that group, and it does become very isolating. You know, the use of the word ladies, which makes me shiver.
See, I'm a little bit off topic now, but because you mentioned ladies, I think, and Steve, maybe you can elaborate on it, but something I notice is that when men say they're confused about all the new rules of engaging with women in the workplace, and then chivalry comes in the conversation and respect, and they think that they want to behave in a certain way because they feel they've been raised in a certain way to behave towards women, that chivalrous, etc. Exactly, and that's a respectful way to do it, but I feel less patronising. And then I think there's men feel confused by that. Is that something you recognise, Steve?
It's not something I subscribe to myself. I completely know what you mean. Like, of course you'd hold the door open for a woman. You'd hold the door open for anyone, I'd like to think.
Exactly.
The chivalrous idea is, I think, something that it definitely exists, but I don't know. Yeah.
Do you think that's particular to British culture, as somebody who's not British?
Maybe, although certainly in countries like Germany,
Yeah.
that is very prevalent as well.
Right.
But then other cultures, such as the Nordics or Holland, where I've spent a lot of my working life, that is definitely not the case.
And it's okay.
Now, are these cultures more equal? In some cases, yes.
I lived in the Czech Republic for a while, and I mean, you always got up on the tube for a woman, and this was something that I felt a little uncomfortable at first for those reasons, that if you get up for someone who's in greater need than you, but a woman is not in greater need than you, so it's patronising to suggest that a woman can't stand up.
Yeah.
Yes, very.
But you had to start conforming to it because everybody did it, so you would get frail old men standing up for women in their 20s, and it was just fine, but it just felt very, very awkward. So I just didn't sit down on the tubes over there. I thought that was the simplest suggestion.
Men simply can't sit down. That's patronising though, isn't
I
it?
thought so, but I mean, cultures are different. I think it was very much, it was a way of being polite.
But that's
the perception. It's not meant to be patronising. It's meant to be polite.
Yeah, and so that behaviour wasn't done with the intention of patronising, but the impact was, and that's where coming back to your point about awareness.
I think that's the key point. Yeah.
But the thing I'm interested, because you're a guy, is do you think women are biased against women?
Well, that's interesting. Before we started this podcast, the three of us took an implicit attitude test to test our own levels of bias. For someone personally who I don't consider myself to consciously bias any group, however I still did come back that I did implicitly bias, and it was quicker for me to make connections between women and family and between men and careers, that despite what I previously would have thought, it came back that I was slightly biased. How about you two?
Oh, I'm biased. I took the same test, and shockingly, I find myself to be biased. But then I can think of loads of examples where indeed I am. I was sharing the example with you earlier. We had an electrician coming round to the house last week, and I said to my husband, "When is he coming?" And he looked around and said, "She is coming tomorrow." So, in my head, that was always going to be a man.
And I took the test, and I was astounded that I'm also biased as someone who's considered herself to be a feminist all my adult life and as long back as I can remember. But again, if I think very hard about it and I look myself in the mirror and look very hard, in my career I have made judgments about women's behaviour that I wouldn't have made about that behaviour if they had been male. And so that was really tough for me to really think about that and to really look myself in the mirror and say, oop, I'm contributing to this as well. I'm not saying that men don't contribute to it, but I have contributed to this.
But we're all in some way. It's everybody's issue. It's everybody's issue.
It is, and I think that's really important, because this isn't, I don't want to be a male basher. because I happen to like them, and they are in my life in every direction that I look in, and and it makes the world a better place. So that it's it's really
easy to overstate that point, though. Doing some research for this podcast, I found references to righteous women who the idea that women should be held to a higher standard, or are held to a higher standard when it comes to bias, and that as women experience bias themselves, they should then therefore empathise with that and show less bias, and if they're not, then that's negative against women. Or then I also saw things about this queen bee syndrome, where women are guilty of pulling the ladder up from the beneath them, things like this, which a lot of pop articles were written around them. I didn't manage to find too much substance behind any of them.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of that is grounded in science or just,
but it's a pervasive.
beliefs.
It's a pervasive kind of idea.
I think the bias that women have against women impacts themselves as much as how they deal with other women. I think by being biased, women hold themselves back. I can think of many examples in the workplace where women have made career decisions themselves based on the fact that they believed that they were going to have to be the primary carer, and that wasn't something that they ever would question. So women hold themselves back in that way, as well as other people.
I think the other thing for me, just picking up on that term, women hold themselves back, is women don't challenge bias enough. And it's that subtle bias that they don't challenge, the bias of language, the bias of behaviour. It's not challenged. And when it's not challenged, it becomes acceptable. So last weekend I was working with a group of American women, sort of between early 20s and mid 30s, and we were talking about language over dinner. And some of the language that I continue to hear in the UK is totally unacceptable in the US.
Such as?
My particular favourite, which is the word ladies. But they have, I don't know how this has come about, but they have worked very hard at making communication gender neutral. And I can remember, the people saying over here in the UK, Americans, they're too PC. Well, is there too PC? Can you be too PC? I don't know. That's an interesting
But
one.
then how do you change that? How do you call it out?
You start.
Yes.
You start.
Because it's difficult. I think women are often very conscious about not wanting to be seen as too feminist, because there seemed to be a school of thought that that's a negative. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I often see it as we don't want to push too far, push too hard. What do we call out? What do we not call out? How do you create that culture, I suppose, where this can be talked about openly and it can be called out openly?
Yeah.
It's the way, I think it's the way that the issue is phrased as well. I mean, I know if it's phrased in a particular way, then it's viewed with kind of mistrust and resentment from men, which ends up not being helpful. If it's something that men are doing and men are performing, that's not something that is necessarily received that well.
So how do you think, as a man, men will receive that challenge? Because I've seen, again, I've had conversations with men, which is about, oh God, I won't even be able to talk to a woman in future. I can't. If I speak to a woman at a bus stop, they'll think that,
It's inclusive. I think that's the key bit, that it's not about. It's gender bias, as in we're doing something that's impacting everyone. I think, we're occupational. Well, I'm an occupational psychologist. We're all in the occupational sphere. Businesses do better when there's gender parity, and there's enough research that shows that.
But do you think men are threatened by that?
There is research to suggest as well, when there's particular pushes for drives to hire more women or different ethnic groups or anything like this, that the majority groups can feel threatened by that.
Okay.
and the way that you fix that is it's about inclusion. It's about all genders together, not about women being raised, but about men and women together collectively fixing the issue. That the way that we're discussing it today is in gender bias is not something that exists in men, that women talk about and how they can fix it and how they can change it. The issue is all of us. This is something that exists in the way that we construct language and the way that we act and behave. And all of us are then part of the solution.
But awareness got to be a good start, no? I mean, when I did the implicit association test and I became aware of my own biases, in gender and in other areas, by the way, it gets you thinking and it makes you think and it makes you so much more conscious. So I would imagine that's the same for everybody. And there's a lot of research around how awareness can help. So if everybody in an organisation takes an IAT around gender or other areas, would that help if we're all more aware that we are biased? Let's just accept that as a starting point.
And that it's a negative, but it's not a negative that you own yourself. It's
No.
a negative that is based in the language that you speak, in the culture that you're from, in the society you have been raised in. That this is something that is part of all of us, that through changing our language we can change. But there's not then a deficit within yourself.
Exactly.
Can I ask something that's very practical? There's been a lot of stuff in the press recently about pay differentials between men and women. So to what extent do you think that that differential is caused by unconscious bias or indeed conscious bias? You got a view?
What do you think, Greetje?
I absolutely think that there's got to be, right? I mean, otherwise some things just simply do not make sense. And we were talking about this earlier, but the Tesco lawsuit is actually quite an interesting one, because there are two groups where they're doing very similar jobs. Women are stacking shelves in the stores, men are stacking shelves in the warehouses, and the pay differential between the two is £4, an average of £8 an hour for women stacking shelves in the stores to an average of £12 an hour, so I've read, for men in the warehouses. That can only be due to gender, because objectively that very much appears to be the same job. So how do you get to a point where the average pay is £4 different? That, to me, that clearly is about a gender differential.
So there was a recent analysis from the Office of National Statistics. So the top line kind of figures were that over the last 6 years, the pay gap has fallen from 10.5% to 9.1%. So there's
Still a lot, right?
But still a lot. Also, I mean, they're very transparent about where they've taken that data from, and it's from people in full-time work. So they did an analysis looking at lots of different factors. They looked at tenure within the company. They looked at which occupation, because there are occupational differences in certain jobs that there are a lot more men in there, and certain jobs there are a lot more women. And whether or not it's full-time or part-time work, the region of work, sector, all these kinds of things. And all that combined accounted for about a third of the gender pay gap, which isn't very much. There's still 2/3 of that pay gap that wasn't accounted for. In their own analysis, they admit that they didn't look at family structure, how many children, who were the caregivers of those children. They didn't look at education or career breaks. And one thing that I think we would probably pitch as well is that it didn't really talk about gender bias and how that has an impact. And I think a lot of it must be
biased, right?
Yeah.
But people seem to almost accept that. I mean, the amount of times that you talk to people, couples, male-female couples, where they have to make decisions around care, and often it becomes a woman being the primary caretaker purely on the basis that the expectation is that the man will earn more. People seem to almost accept that, right?
Sadly.
So I have some interesting findings around personality and gender. So we mentioned before, I think Greetje brought up the point that differences kind of between groups are kind of a lot smaller than the differences within groups. You know, some women have very strong personality preferences one direction than the other, and the same with men. But certainly in the literature, in the academic literature, there are gender differences that you see in personality. So the most kind of prominent personality model, the Big Five model. Would you guys like to guess?
Go on then.
Talk about personality traits. So extroversion, is it typically
probably
men higher?
typically women, probably.
That's correct. Women are more extroverted, slightly taken as a whole.
I'm surprised by that.
You're surprised by that?
Yeah, but maybe that's my definition of extroversion. But go ahead, keep going.
Agreeableness.
Women.
Emotional stability.
Men.
Openness to experience. Curiosity.
Women.
Slightly men.
You're not cringing.
Biting your tongue slightly. Conscientiousness.
Women.
This was an interesting one. A study of 55 nations found that generally it was women, but in the UK it was slightly higher for men.
Really?
Which is interesting. Interesting that there is a kind of cultural difference there. And we find this in Thomas as well. Looking at Thomas data, our PPA, which is a personality measure, but it's behavioural preferences in the workplace. Looking at dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. And again, we see gender differences. So women are more likely to lead with influence and steadiness, and men are more likely to lead with dominance or compliance.
But what's the percentage differences? Are they pronounced?
I mean,
couple of percentage points.
It's never more than 4 percentage points difference.
See, and this is where I struggle, because stories like that often make the media, and they make very good headlines, and they perpetuate the story that men or women are supposedly so different, and that might on average be so, slightly, and you're the statistician, you might disagree with the word slightly.
I'm going to agree with you, because the way that we a lot of PPA assessments get taken in the UK every year. We have millions of assessments taken to look at that data. Statistically speaking, even the smallest of differences you would find to be statistically significant on that sample. Whether that's practical and meaningful is up for debate, but certainly saying men are compliant and dominant and women are influential and steady isn't particularly useful. We did a really interesting research study quite recently on, we tracked around 300 people over a year who were applying for recruitment consultant roles. And we tracked their success through the process, but we also looked at their gender, and we were looking at other demographic groups as well. We didn't find, within this one sample of people applying for a recruitment consultant role, we didn't find any differences in behavioural preferences, any kind of personality differences within that sample.
Was there an age difference in the sample?
We didn't find any differences across all the demographic groups that we looked at.
Really?
So by using that tool within the recruitment process, it was a really good way of them reducing bias, because you had something more objective to bring into the recruitment decision. But it was very interesting for us to see that where there might be, again, I totally agree, small differences really between men and women when you take the population as a whole, when you actually look for people within one population, which is the population of people applying for recruitment consultant roles, those differences disappeared, which is a really, really fascinating finding for us.
And that's the bit to focus on, isn't it? Because what good does it do that on average, in a wide sample, there are a couple of percentage point difference in preferences and behaviours? That only perpetuates the bias. What's more important, surely, is to find a way to look at the individuals and what those individuals' behaviours are going to be. So I'm really pleased to see that within a concrete sample of people applying for a certain role, the behavioural preferences were no different. So by using something that's a more objective tool, such as an assessment, you cut through that bias in a way, and through those expectations that perhaps women weren't going to be dominant enough for those positions. Would you say that that's valid?
I completely agree, and I think that's something to bear in mind as well when you do see research that's talking about gender differences, that actually when you've got people who are standing in front of you, not as a man, not as a woman, but as whatever kind of occupation that they're doing and whatever role they're doing now, that's the person that you're looking at, not their gender. So yeah, I completely agree that those kind of statistics aren't particularly helpful. People are really interested in gender bias and gender differences, sorry, not gender bias in research, but I'm not sure how helpful it is.
No, exactly. I don't know how helpful. We get too hooked up on that, and I sometimes wonder what's the point of all the research that is there to point out more differences. Where is it going to lead us? How is it going to help us? It always makes me a little bit uncomfortable. So we talked a lot about pay gap and how there is still this pay gap of about 10%, 9%?
9.1% in the UK currently.
So, and I think that this is often why women make career choices after maternity leave, going back part-time or not going back at all or taking extended leave. And so in this country, we've obviously now got paternity leave as a possibility, but it doesn't necessarily come with the pay that maternity pay comes with. So I personally think, but I'd be interested to hear your opinions, that if companies have a level of maternity pay that they offer, that they should offer exactly the same paternity pay. I think that would make a massive impact on equality in leave after having children.
I wholeheartedly agree. If you compare our approach to pay after child giving, whatever it is, compared to other countries, that inequality does drive particular decisions within a caregiving couple.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I 100% agree that paternity pay and maternity pay should be equal, and that.
Oh, here comes a big but.
Well, my issue with that is I don't think it goes far enough to address the issue. I'm just thinking of my own peer group. I don't know how many of my male friends would then all of a sudden just say, right, it'll be me.
Why not?
Because they've grown up in this culture with these expectations for their whole lives, and then suddenly to change that doesn't mean that certain expectations about how your life is going to be your entire life.
But the take-up of new opportunity will always take time.
100%. And again, I 100% agree that it needs to happen and it should happen now. But I don't think we'll see the effects for a long time. I don't think it's everything that we can do.
Well, it'll never be a nirvana, but if you don't start somewhere...
Oh, yeah,
it
I completely agree with that.
And I wonder whether that is... the younger generation would actually have the same opinion. I mean, my only experience with younger generation are my own children, and certainly I know that if I said to my son, if you had the choice when you have children, it would be a choice for him. It wouldn't be an automatic, I'm going to be the breadwinner and my partner, whoever that is going to be the caregiver. I think my sense is, and having spoken to him, it would be more equal, more of a decision. But at the moment, the way that maternity and paternity pay means that conversation may never take place in some couples.
No, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't understand why there hasn't been a single man in this country yet who has raised this as a discriminatory issue. You know, many people work in organisations where women get enhanced maternity pay, but men do not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why do men accept that?
Yeah,
it baffles me. And I'm looking forward, I suppose, to a day where a man would claim discrimination because they would have a point.
Yeah.
And I think it would be able to lead to a cultural shift.
Really good point.
So shall we all have some closing thoughts? Because we've covered a lot, obviously. So Steve?
So one thing, I mean, as a psychologist, I mean, there are obviously unconscious biases in the processes within an organisation. One thing that we're very passionate about this at Thomas, and this is something that we can help you with. So I think what I'd like to kind of as a closing statement just say is that if you do have an interest in this and you want to see what this looks like in your organisation, we are skilled at going into organisations, following their processes, following their recruitment processes, their development processes, and looking to see where these sources of bias can start to creep in and what you can do about that. And I think it's everyone's responsibility. It's not something that exists within an individual, it's a collective responsibility, and it's as male as it is female.
Lillian?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the solution has to be a gender-neutral solution where both, all genders are participating. I think, and women need to play their part in that as well as men. Clearly, the subject is very complex. Clearly, it's not going to change overnight, even though I'd like it to. I think where I would want, I think there should be more research, particularly around the pay gap and what's driving that pay gap. Because another statistic that I heard a couple of weeks ago is that the lower paid unskilled jobs that are mainly currently done by women will go through technology in a very short space of time. I think they were saying 5 or 10 years. So we have to know more about this because it could get worse. So if I had my magic wand, it would change tomorrow. It isn't going to do that, but you know, the solution's a joint one. I think is a big thing for me.
The only thing I'd add to that is that part of the solution has got to be awareness, as I said before, and a willingness to be open about it and to talk about it. If everybody is aware, if everybody accepts that bias is a given, and that the solution isn't in changing the bias but in understanding it and tackling it, I think that's a good starting point. It's interesting because there's a lot more we can talk about, and obviously half an hour isn't very long to cover all of the subjects. We'd be very keen to keep the conversation going, so I'd encourage you all to join the conversation, and thank you very much for listening today.